Everyone to today's session of Lessons Learned. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brittany Connor. I'm the Assistant Director of Marketing and Communications for the Gardner Institute. And we would like to begin today by acknowledging the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians people, traditional custodians of the land on which the Gardner Institute resides, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples here today. So today's session is going to be recorded, and we will be sending the recording to all of our registered guests today. And we have enabled the Q&A and chat. So if you have any questions for our guests, please use those and feel free to discuss with other participants in the chat. So I'll pass it over to Katie to get this started.
Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. This is the fourth installment of Lessons Learned. It may be the first one you're attending. So just to give you a little background, this series was sort of formed to provide an opportunity for the Gardner Institute to just engage in dialogue with some of our favorite authors. And today we have two of my favorite authors, Peter Felten and Leo Lambert, both who have long and great histories with the Gardner Institute. So we're super excited to have you here. You're great people and you do great work. So the combination really is exciting. So it is my pleasure to introduce our two guests today. So Peter Felten is a professor of history. He's also the executive director of the Center for Engaged Learning and assistant provost for teaching and learning at Elon University. He has published 7 books about undergraduate education, including Connections Are Everything, A College Student's Guide to Relationship-Rich Education, co-authored by Isis Ortiz-Vega, Leo Lambert, and Oscar Miranda Tapia, with an open access online version. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the day. And he is also on the advisory board for the National Survey of Students' Engagement, NSSE, and is a fellow at the Gardner Institute. So welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody, for having me.
Excellent. And Leo Lambert. He is the president emeritus at Elon, that would be Elon. Play on your name there, Leo. He served as the president from 1999 to 2018, leading Elon's rise to national prominence by promoting a student-centered culture that values strong relationships between students, their faculty, and staff members. He's focused on developing students as global citizens, ethical leaders, and creative problem solvers. Leo is also the author of the Undergraduate Experience. Oh boy, I can't talk today. Focusing institutions on what matters most, as well as co-authoring Relationship-Rich Education, How Human Connections Drive Success in College. And so welcome, Leo.
Thank you, Katie. It's good to be with you and with everybody out there in Zoom land.
Well, we are very excited. I see we have a very full room, so we welcome everybody. And we do want this to be interactive, so we do encourage your questions either in the Q&A or the chat, and we will be pausing a couple of times today to ask those questions. So welcome. We want to start, I always like to start with a passage from the book. So I'm going to ask Peter to read a little bit about why it matters so much to start with a warm welcome.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, this is a quote from Yvette Perez, who was a student that Leo and I interviewed at City Tech as part of the City University of New York. We interviewed Yvette in 2019, and Yvette described herself as an immigrant, lifelong New York resident, and aspiring astronaut. And she talked about her expectations coming to university as a first-gen student and how she hadn't experienced high school as a very welcoming or personalized space. And she was really struck by what happened when she first met her advisor at City Tech. She said this, quote, "He welcomed me in a very warm way that I didn't really expect from an advisor or any staff member because high school was kind of non-personal. And the first thing he said is, 'How are you today?' And that meant a lot to me because not many people take the time to find out how you're doing. And so that's Yvette's quote. But what was really striking to me, and I think to us, Katie, about this, is how often simple questions and simple engagement, smiles, how are you today, calling students by name, how important that can be to establish this just foundational sense that I belong here, that I'm welcomed here, that I matter here.
Excellent.
Yvette was one of the very first students we talked to. We interviewed about 300 people for relationship-rich education, 200 of whom were students. And Yvette was in that very first institution we visited, CUNY Tech. But this question of how are you was present on virtually every campus we visited, community colleges, the Ivy League, everywhere in between. It was just remarkable how often students commented on how much they appreciated when someone asked them in a non-perfunctory way how they were doing, and to take a few minutes to listen generally to their answer. It's so powerful.
And so doable, right? I mean, it costs nothing. Everybody can do it. It's just making that just a little bit of effort. So,
but it's also
that's
countercultural sometimes. Students really expect that, they're one of a very large number, that they're here to get some stuff done. And so when someone actually pauses, because it's not just the how are you buzz by, it's the how are you and pause.
right.
That's what really matters. Really feeling seen, really feeling appreciated is what students need.
Waiting for the answer, not just asking the question.
Exactly.
One of my favorite quotes from the book is, and I repeat this all the time, and I think about it in my own life, is from Steve Grande at James Madison University, who's director of civic and community engagement up there. And he said, every day before I go into work, I try to raise my consciousness about how much my words matter to students. And I think this is an illustration of that, right? That people remember years later how a moment of care really made a difference in their university or college career. And just reminding ourselves about how powerful our voices are, how important the 5-minute conversation in the stairway can be. For us, it's another 5-minute conversation, but done with intentionality and care can make all the difference to a student's life.
One other thing I want to build on what Leo's saying, that this idea of welcome gets me thinking about, is a concept that we heard in an interview with a colleague, David Scobie, who's leads this national project called Bringing Theory to Practice. And David had this lovely phrase, and he said, what students need is relentless welcome. And the idea behind relentless welcome is I think a really helpful critique of what I have done and what a lot of us do, which is we pay a lot of attention to the first day of class, the first time a student's on campus, orientation and all this. And those are very important. So I'm not minimizing that. But, the students need to feel welcome. They need to feel attended to. They need to feel like they matter on December 3rd as much as on September 3rd. And so this idea that in our interactions, in the way we design our courses and programs, in the way we interact with students, casual ways, formal ways, we're creating a space where they feel welcomed, where they feel seen, where they feel cared for. That's just really essential.
That brings me to the next point that I wanted to address. You talk about in the book a lot about what happens in a classroom. And so, Leo, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what makes a relationship-rich education in the classroom, and how can faculty and other educators work in the classroom to really make that difference?
Sure. Well, when you think about it, every new semester presents an opportunity for students to form four or five important new relationships in their lives, right? As we were writing in the very early stages of doing research for relationship-rich education, Peter and I, along with our colleague Jason Husser, who directs the Elon University poll here, fired up the polling apparatus and did a national survey of 4,000 college graduates nationally. And what we found in general is the more significant relationships students had in college with faculty, staff, and peers, the more likely they were to say college was satisfying or extremely satisfying, and that college was worth it. Interestingly, we asked them to think about the most important relationship they had with a faculty member or staff member in over the course of their university career. And we asked them, where did they meet that person? And it was by far, the majority response was students met their most important mentor during their first year and in the classroom. So this has, enormous implications for how we staff our first year classrooms, right? And our second year classrooms for that matter. I think it's really a shame that 50% of faculty nationally are contingent faculty, and it's important for students to have continuing relationships with these important professors they have over the course of their first year, because that's when the relationship is seeded. But for many of these students, it's going to last, for a long period of time. So I always point to that as another really important piece of evidence to think about why institutions need to invest in a permanent faculty, a faculty that our students know are going to be there from semester to semester. I think another big point to emphasize here is, and I'm sure we'll get into this later in the conversation as we do other readings. I think classrooms are places of inspiration for students. They discover new passions. Their minds get lighted on fire, sometimes for the first time, and that's an enormously exciting thing for students. We heard over and over again about active and engaged pedagogy and how students who had lots of opportunity to build strong connections with the subject matter, but also strong connections with their professors and with their classmates, because of the way that classroom was managed and conducted, was very powerful, and seeds to a lot of peer relationship building in the classroom that is really, really important as well. Peter and I were out visiting the University of Wyoming back in September. And I think the final point I want to make here is that it's not always necessary for faculty in the classroom to think about, oh my goodness, I have to reshape my whole class. I need to rethink everything in order to make my classroom more relationship rich. We've come away kind of upholding the power of the simple, I guess I would put it, the simple idea. And after Peter and I gave this little talk out in Wyoming, a professor came up to us and said, I read Relationship-Rich Education, and I'm doing one thing differently in my teaching this semester. I'm spending a lot more time at the beginning of the semester talking to students about office hours. Not that they're just from 10 to noon on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I really want you to come. I want to get to know you. You don't have to have a question. You don't have to have a problem. You don't need to be, thinking about dropping the class. Come by and see me. And I think it was, a professor obviously had a realization that once those students cross his threshold for the first time, they're much more likely to come back when they have a question or a problem and so forth. So it's that simple strategy to invite students towards a more relationship-rich experience in the context of classroom learning, which includes office hours and what happens before class and what happens after class. Simple can be very powerful. We learned that lesson over and over again in writing these books.
So do you have any strategies for those faculty who are struggling? They have the office hours and they're not being utilized.
Peter, do you want to take a
Yeah,
whack?
sure. Great question, Katie. And I'm curious and wonder if people want to put in chat or in Q&A if they have suggestions or ideas. A couple things that seem really important. One, as Leo said, is first helping students understand what office hours are, what they're for, who they're for, how to use them, etc. I'll put a link in the chat in a minute on our resource page for Connections Are Everything. We have some resources about office hours for students, and it can be really helpful. Students often don't understand what office hours are. So first thing is making sure they understand. And secondly, I think students have this perception, often faculty have this perception, that office hours should be individual and singular and all this. And there are times when you need to have a heart-to-heart conversation, or a student's struggling and wants to talk one-on-one. But often what we heard in our interviews, you see this in the research, is that actually group office hours can be really powerful. So for example, a faculty member we interviewed for relationship-rich education, we profile in the book, Sean Vicera, he's a professor at the University of Iowa. He was chair of psychology, he's a professor of psychology. Taught this huge intro to psychology course. And he started having his office hours in one of the main first-year dorms at the University of Iowa in a big open conference room on the ground floor. And he said what happened is office hours went from something that almost nobody, even though he would teach hundreds and hundreds of students a semester, he said, 5 students a semester total would come to his office hours in the olden days. Now he gets literally hundreds. Because they come in packs, he encourages them to come with roommates or study partners. And they come and they help each other and they listen to each other. And so he's really transformed the experience of office hours. One other really clever example that we heard about in our research, but we didn't put in either book, I don't think, was at San Antonio College in Texas, where they have it's a community college. So they have small sections of 30 or 40 students, but lots and lots of sections of classes like Introduction to Biology. And what they've started to do is have all the faculty members have a few office hours in their office. And then every full-time faculty member is responsible for a couple office hours in a main spot on campus, either in the cafeteria or in the library. And so all students in Intro to Bio know there will be someone who teaches Intro to Bio in the library in a prominent place between these hours. And they tell their students this because often students, they appreciate talking to me if I'm their professor, but really they have a question about how cells divide. And they just need a knowledgeable, smart person to be able to do this. So I love the idea of saying in large multi-section courses, how do we spread the labor a little bit and know that my schedule is not going to sync with each of my students' schedules, but between my colleagues and I, we can cover a lot of time without taking any more of our time and serve a lot more students.
Excellent.
I think it's also important.
Go ahead, Leo.
I was going to say, we were reminded again in doing even more interviewing of students when we wrote Connections Are Everything, that particularly I think for first generation students and other students that comprise this group that we think of as the rising new majority of American college students, first gen, students of color, working students who are balancing a lot, right? Or sometimes feel that they're on the margins of our campus. How intimidating a relationship with a professor can feel. And I think just putting that right out there is important too. We oftentimes think of ourselves as nice, approachable people, but we can be scary too. Because of our titles or our age or what have you. I think this is easier if 6 generations of your family have gone to college, and the sort of the hidden curriculum about how college works has been part of the dinner table conversation the entire time you've been growing up. But that's increasingly not true. And I think it's important that just very simple, basic idea be on the table, and that we be cognizant of it.
I agree completely, Leo. I just want to lift up a really important point in the chat from Karen Huxtable Jester. And there's a lot of good things happening in the chat, but Karen put a really important point in there, which is there's not one single way to do this work. Context matters, identities matter, and things like this. So something that an old-looking, tall, white guy like me can do, who students expect to be a professor when they see me walk in the room, is different than what some of my colleagues can do. And it's not because I'm more capable or something like this, but there's identities I have that read professor, that for some of my colleagues, unfortunately, they don't have those identities, or they can't expect their students to trust them. And so Leo and I are really trying to be clear in the book. We want to be clear here that we're not saying there's like one way to do this and everybody has to behave in a certain way. I know you didn't mean that either, Karen, but I think it's really important that as we think about how to do this relational work, we recognize that different ones of us are going to have different assets and different capacities to do this work. I'm confident all of us can do it, but how it looks for me might be very different than how it looks for you in a very different setting with very different students and very different identities. So Karen, thanks so much for raising that in the chat.
Thank you. There's a lot of great ideas. I like the idea of calling them student question hours. It makes that seem less scary, I think, probably for a lot of students. So we're going to pause for a minute and take some questions. So we encourage you to ask the questions either in the chat or the Q&A, and Brittany will share those questions with us.
So we have one question from Mark Palmer. I'll read it out. I always ask students, how are you during first year success course? We did it by Google Forms, and I randomized the order and initiated that we, including me, are all in this together among with the students. Do you have any similar experiences? And on a funny note, one of the questions asked one day was, who's that provost guy? Does he do anything? He seemed to think he was important.
Thanks, Brittany. I love that. And I also am trying to figure out who that provost guy is and why he thinks he's important, but that's not for here right now. So just 2 quick thoughts in response to your question, Mark. One is that I think a lot of us during COVID and emergency remote teaching did sort of regular check-ins with students, whether they were surveys on a Google form or something like this, or just a chat thing or whatever, just checking in, like, how are you doing right now? And how's your day? How's your life? How are you feeling? And this research suggests that was one of the things students appreciated a lot about what happened during emergency remote teaching. And I wondered why a lot of us have stopped doing that. It seems like a reasonable thing to do, to just take a minute or 2 at the beginning of class and check in. One other thing that I saw years ago when I was at a different university, and I thought it was so clever. And the professor who did this, his name was John Sloop. He was a professor at Vanderbilt at the time in communication. And he taught a class of 40 or 50 students. And he had a question of the day at the beginning of every class. It was mostly a lecture class, but there was a question of the day. You'd come in and it would be up on the board or on a slide for maybe 5 minutes before. Usually it was related to the the topic of the day, to the reading or something like this. And it was something you could answer really quickly. Which of these three do you prefer the most, or something like this, right? Sometimes it was funny, sometimes it was serious. Bang, when class started, John went around the room and called each student by name and said, what's your answer to the question? Leo, Peter, Katie, Brittany. And it was fascinating to see him do this. It went really fast. He said he learned names really well. And all students were always there on time, because he was going to call on them if they showed up 15 minutes late. He'd say, Leo, glad you're here. What's your favorite way to do whatever? And it was embarrassing, but charming. But it brought this energy into the room that, to Karen's point earlier, I don't know that I could do in my class, but I thought it was such a clever way to really engage students and have everybody say something and everybody be recognized right from the start of class. And it took like 4 minutes, but it was just this high energy moment at the beginning of his classes. I so admired it.
Brittany, you want to go on to the next question?
Yes, so we have a few questions about remote and online classes. So the next one is from Heather Swanson. Do you have recommendations to enhance online office hours for online faculty? I have no one attend, though I do get a lot of individual meetings for issues.
So two thoughts. One is, there's a wonderful book I'll put in the chat, you may know, by Rebecca Glazier, called Connecting in the Online Classroom. And I really highly recommend it. Really, really helpful and thoughtful. And then secondly, and Heather, you probably do a lot of things that are amazing. So probably just keep doing whatever works. But thinking about online office hours as a time, I think too often office hours are one-on-one. And so creating something in sort of like the Q&A here, where any student can ask a question during the week, and then you're going to create a video response. And it's going to be, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and not say, Brittany asked this question, but just say, okay, so a student in my office hours asked this question. Here's the answer. And so you're creating a resource, a running resource through the semester of short videos from you responding to student questions. I think that does two things. One, it answers a lot of student questions. Secondly, it sets a tone that you're available to answer student questions. And so I think that's a really powerful technique too.
If I could add, I had the pleasure of spending a little bit of time when we were doing research for relationship-rich education at Southern New Hampshire University, which has 180,000 online students. I'm sure you all know the model. So it's a really big operation. Their secret sauce, as they call it, the way they try to personalize online instruction there is through at least weekly phone calls with academic advisors to vary the mode of communications with students, and also to have telephone as opposed to voice-to-voice contact through their system of writing coaches that are oftentimes partner with students through multiple courses over multiple years of their degree programs at Southern New Hampshire. So Peter talked about putting up videos. I think sometimes varying the media by which we are talking to students, and not underestimating the power of human-to-human synchronous communication to the learning process, I think is really important too.
So our final question in the Q&A we have here is, for online classes, should we take the time to connect at the start or at the end of class?
Yes. To elaborate just a little bit, but well, a couple things. First, you have to, we all have to recognize there's constraints and boundaries on how much time we have and how much space and why our students are coming to things. I think what we should do as much as possible is create educationally purposeful opportunities for students to connect with each other in the class. So that can be breakout rooms. It can be any number of discussion boards or other kinds of boards and all that kind of technology stuff you can do. So it doesn't have to be out loud, although it can be, as Leo said. It doesn't have to be on video, although it can be written and other things. But I think we should have multiple opportunities, ideally in every class session, if you're doing a synchronous class session, for students to connect in purposeful ways with each other. I'm not a huge fan, because the research isn't that great, on just doing icebreakers and things like that at the beginning of every class. Or at the end of every class, because that, I think some students will appreciate that, and that's great. Some students won't, and they'll start coming late because they know we're going to kill time, or they're going to perceive we're killing time. So I try to encourage, I try to have really purposeful things, often right at the start of class, where students are talking about a reading or talking about a video they watched, or doing something that's going to springboard into class. And students then find out, I hope, that those first few minutes of class are really important. They're setting them up for something, and they're somewhat enjoyable because they're working on something and not just listening.
No, I'm not unmuted. Thank you. It's really great questions. We appreciate them, and keep them coming. We'll go back to some guest questions at the end, but I'm going to ask Leo to share a passage from the book about being inspired to learn.
So I went to Nevada State College and met Jose Robles. Nevada State College is outside of Las Vegas, and it is one of the most impressive institutions I've ever visited. Hispanic serving institution, relatively new school. It's only about 25 years old. But I've visited few institutions that have such a profound culture of student success. I remember having an exit interview with the provost and saying, I would hire every single person I met here today. I mean, it was just a fabulous group of faculty and staff. But one young man, Jose Robles, is a young man I enjoyed having lunch with. And this is Jose's quote. My professor made the course interactive in a way that something as boring as rocks became interesting. Jose is a nursing student, and he's assigned to this introductory geology class, right, which he thinks has nothing to do with what he wants to do in college or in life. And he goes into this class with just this get me out of here attitude, right? But he changes his mind, and he said, the passion that she wasn't just giving me information. Her subject was something that she loved. And the way that she explained it, for some reason, I wanted to learn everything about rocks. The most important thing is the class became a community. She had us interact with each other and with the subject. It just came together because of her passion. He talked about being out there in the field in 100-degree heat in the Nevada desert, collecting rocks with his classmates, hard stuff. But I think what shone through about Jose's experience later in our conversation was that I think his conception of himself as a result of taking this class changed, that he was not just a passive recipient of knowledge. I think he began to think of himself as a scholar, as somebody who really liked to learn, who was fascinated by other people's fascinations, and wanted to learn more, in his case, about geology. I'll never forget that conversation, and it always reminds me, again, a point I made earlier about who's in the classroom with first-year students, right?
It's an excellent point. Thank you. Peter, did you want to have any Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, yeah, just one thing to add to what Leo said is when you listen to Jose's quote, the really interesting thing for me as a faculty member is he isn't saying I'm spending a ton of time one-on-one with this professor. Right? What he's saying is the way she taught the course, the way she designed the course, the way she shared her passion, the way she had us as students interact with the material and with each other. That's what was so motivating and so connecting for him. And I think sometimes as faculty, when we think about, or staff, as we think about doing relationship-rich stuff, we often have this frame that it's always one-on-one. And one-on-one work, I'm a huge fan of one-on-one work, and it's very powerful. And I had a transformed education because of what a couple individuals did for me. But Leo and I talked to a lot of students who had really transformative education in settings that weren't one-on-one. And so including Jose as an example of that course being transformative for him because of the way the professor designed and taught the course, not because the professor spent 12 hours one-on-one outside of class. So I think part of what the lesson for me of all this work is how do we think about designing environments, courses, programs, where students are going to be immersed in opportunities to connect with their peers, with staff, with faculty in ways that are really educationally powerful. And that's what our job is primarily. Some of it can be one-on-one, but most of it for most of us just can't be. There's too many students and not enough time for us.
Katie, if I could follow up on that we haven't really talked, we've been mostly talking about faculty in the classroom, but I do want to say a word about the enormous power that staff bring to this work. There are 2 staff people for every faculty person on most campuses. Everybody from people that work in dining halls and clean residence halls to IT folks, everybody that works in student life. It's a very diverse group of wonderful people. I can't tell you how many students we talked to who also said the most important mentor I had was a staff person on campus. The person who supervised my campus employment when I worked in catering was somebody that I learned so much from, and about being a professional, about showing up, about hard work, getting the job done, so on and so forth. This past spring, I had the pleasure of visiting the Milwaukee School of Engineering. 80% engineering students at that school. There's a business program, a very small nursing program as well, but it's mostly engineers. And they have put together a group of about 40 people. It's kind of big. It's called the Achieve Team. And it includes faculty and deans, but it also includes people that I call dining hall heroes, people that work in dining halls that students love, and people from campus safety and police, and people from accounts payable. And it's sort of this grassroots effort to think about, both in the classroom and outside the classroom, how can we shape the cultures of our institutions so that they are more focused on relationships and student success? How can we, to give one example, I think that was very powerful, they shared with me, students dread walking into the Office of Accounts Payable and have a conversation about an outstanding bill, right? It's nothing that any of us really would look forward to. How do you reshape the culture so that when the student has that experience, they feel like, I expected this to be not positive, but I feel like I met somebody that's an advocate for me staying in school and finding a solution to my issue. So much of this is simple and is done as individuals. It's the commitment we make to take the time to have all of these conversations, to adopt these practices, to be more intentional about this work. But I think it gets supercharged when it's in the culture, when it's just, this is something that the institution is committed to publicly, and it's part of even the, dare I say, the reward structure of the institution. So you're not always having to do this, on the QT without anyone having anyone recognize it. So our colleagues on the staff are playing an enormously important frontline role in creating relationship-rich education, and just wanted to underscore that point.
Thank you. It is a really vital point, and I'm glad you brought that up. And so my next question really goes to the other part of that equation, the student. And I know, having a current college student myself, sometimes students are open and receptive to these relationships, and sometimes they're not. So how do we get students involved in the development of these relationships?
Great question, Katie. And I want to say both, some of that is going to be, personality and things like this. Some students are shy. We interviewed a student at the University of Iowa, Alexa Olson, who said her goal as a first-year student was to meet no one because she was so shy, right? So there are students like that. There's more outgoing students. But the research also says, especially first-generation students, often don't understand that the relationships they form with staff, with faculty, with their peers are going to be educationally helpful for them, educationally meaningful for them. And so some of what we need to do, those of us who work in higher education, is help students understand that these relationships matter to you. They matter to your well-being. They matter to your learning. They matter ultimately to your persistence and to your success. And so you don't have to become friends with everyone. Everyone doesn't have to be your mentor and things like this, but you can have constructive, meaningful, helpful relationships with a wide range of people at the college, at the institution, online, in person, however you do it, in ways that are going to really make your educational experience more enjoyable and more successful. And so I think it's on us to help students understand that, and then to create environments where they can connect and help them understand some strategies that they can use, because they might say, I'm busy, I'm a parent, I'm working, I don't have time for this. Okay, so how do we make our classes relational so that they have that? How do we make any experience they have at the institution a place where they can connect meaningfully with someone?
If I could add to that, I think it's so important that we unmask or unveil this business for students. I think we in this enterprise don't do a particularly good job of telling students early enough and often enough that set of relationships that they form in college with faculty, staff, and peers that are especially meaningful to them will be one of the most important outcomes of their college or university experience. There's so much emphasis on grades. There's so much emphasis on achievement. There's so much emphasis on the transactions, the getting through things, the clearing hoops, the amassing credit hours. I don't think we talk about this constellation of mentors as the thing that they're really going to look back on in 10 years and 20 years and 40 years and really value the most. And to Peter's point about strategies, early on, helping them through simple exercises to remind them that they're multidimensional people. They need mentors and they need academic and intellectual mentors. They need mentors who are helping them think about their well-being and their emotional health, their physical health. They need people perhaps to guide them in terms of spiritual well-being, how to navigate the university and instrumental kinds of concerns, multiple people, not just one person. in the Connections Are Everything website, connectionsareverything.org, there's a wonderful workshop that was put together by a faculty member at Elon, Professor Danielle Lake, who runs our Center for Design Thinking. And we run this dozens of times this semester. It's a Constellation of Mentors workshop for first-year students. It's an hour long, and it just gets them to think about who's already in your life that you're counting on. Who are the relationships that you have now? You've got assets. You're bringing assets to this process right from the get-go. And then who might you, in these various dimensions of your life, like to build relationship with? Let's write some names down. Who's on your mind? And then to begin to think about, okay, what are the little micro strategies that I could take today or tomorrow to take a first step towards building these relationships? Stay after class, write an email, go to office hours, go make an appointment with somebody. But to emphasize their agency and the importance of their taking a step towards creating these relationships as well. I think for many students, this comes for extroverted students, for affluent students. I think this comes much more easily. They've seen it done. But for other students, it's harder. And so it's both about the unveiling of this as a really important piece of the undergraduate experience, and then unveiling the strategies for students to make it happen for themselves too.
Thank you for that. And I'm pretty sure I saw in the chat the link for the Connections Are Everything book, and we'll make sure we include that when we send out the recording afterwards so that everybody has access to that. And all of a sudden we're down to 11 minutes. I don't know where the time goes, but we'll try and get in a couple of more questions. Brittany?
Yeah, so we have one from in the chat. Can you talk about maintaining relationship-rich education amid faculty and staff turnover?
Well, you're muted.
I thought I clicked it. I didn't click it. That's a hard one. Wow. I was reflecting just this morning how much work faculty and staff did during the pandemic to extend grace and to give extra time and to do check-ins with people. And you know, I one of the excuse me, I don't know what happened there. One of the things that can you hear me? All right, sorry about that. This process has reminded me again about the power of our words and actions in higher education, and how much how meaningful this work is and the influence that it has on students. But we've seen, particularly I think in the last few years, how much of a toll it takes as well. I mean, it's demanding work, it's hard work. So I don't know. I guess this is a really hard question, and I would say this work is hardest, I think, when people feel like they are doing it by themselves, when they are alone, when this is an uphill battle, when it's countercultural. And so I think the more that we can find teams of like-minded people to work with, colleagues, starting in a department, starting with a group of people, maybe working your way up to something like the Milwaukee School of Engineering is doing, it feels, I think, less lonely and less hard and more rewarding and reinvigorating when you feel like this is a rising tide that is the entire institution is invested in. And so try to get some like-minded people together and to think about how we can work together to advance relationship-rich education. I'm sorry I stumbled my way through that question, but it's really a great question and a hard one. I'd be interested in everyone else's reaction too.
Well, Leo, I really appreciate your answer, both on how do you sustain this, how do you do this as an individual, and then how do you build the communities and the departments and the programs and the institutions that can sustain that work. One other thing I was thinking of, and I'm going to put on my rose-colored glasses now because this is an explicitly, perhaps overly optimistic statement, but one of the things that happens with turnover is often hiring. And so thinking about, as John Zubizarreta, who's sort of a guru of honors education, we interviewed him for relationship-rich education, and John pointed out how often it is colleges and universities will say they value something and then hire something else, right? So we say we value faculty who are excellent teachers and who really work with students in the classroom, and then hire the person who's published the most books, even if they haven't demonstrated the first thing. And Leo and I have heard this talking with staff in a number of different institutions too, where staff will say, my evaluation that I do every year is the budget balanced and do the programs fill? And it's never about the supervising I do of 20 student workers and the mentoring I do in these roles, right? So how do we actually align our hiring practices and our hiring priorities, our reward structures and our reward priorities with this kind of work? Because that makes it easier to sustain. Doesn't make it easy, but easier to sustain.
Well
So
said, Peter.
looks like we have time to take this one last question here. Can you share your thoughts and lessons for supporting students with disabilities? What stories and examples can you share of supportive strategies?
Thanks, Brittany, for the question, and whoever asked it. Really good question. It's challenging in a short question like that because, of course, students with disabilities is a vast category that ranges from students with visual disabilities or mobility disabilities to students who are neurodiverse in different ways, et cetera. So I'm going to have to generalize and in answering. And of course, there's legal obligations and moral obligations we have to support all our students in ways that are really clear. What we heard in our interviews from students was how important it is for staff and faculty to see students as whole humans. So not attending only to an issue, a disability, for example, but recognizing the disability is also not trivial necessarily for all our students. So in some ways, it goes back to the Yvette Perez quote. And what we heard from students that's valued is someone taking the time to connect with a student in an authentic way and say, tell me about your educational experience. Tell me about your educational aspirations. Help me understand what I can do, what this institution can do to support you in reaching these things. And so not assuming we understand or not treating students, I don't know, with kid gloves or anything else, but really thinking about how do we just understand the student's experience well enough that we can act as an advocate and supporter for them. That's what we heard from students, with lots of nuance for different stories.
I think the other thing that all of our institutions right now are facing is the need to staff up to support students in this regard. Because the first thing that comes to mind, particularly like, for example, for the first years that I taught last fall, how much mental health and anxiety in particular is a part of this disabilities equation. We've added tremendous resources and new modalities to serve students. But the game has changed significantly. And I think there's just no question that I think many of our institutions, including well-resourced institutions, feel like we are simply not adequately staffed to serve the severity of the need that exists, to be honest.
That's a tough one. I think that we hear that in our transformative conversations throughout the pandemic. We just heard faculty, staff, all levels saying that they just don't have the resources to meet all of the students' needs. And so I think it's a major issue for higher ed, is to really think about how do we address that important aspect. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I wanted to just give you each an opportunity. If you had some final thoughts you wanted to share, or one thing you would want to say as we get ready to close. Leo looks like he's unmuted, so I'll go to you first if you're okay with that.
I'm happy. I apologize for my 9-year-old granddaughter tried to FaceTime me in the middle of this. She's homesick from school today. My phone wasn't on, but I wasn't expecting a FaceTime call during this webinar this afternoon. So apologies for the interruption. I guess I would come back to something I've already said, Katie, which is this agenda can seem hard and overwhelming, and focus on I think by being intentional, which is I think the most important. Intentionality is the most important word in this work, and by committing to some simple changes in practices and aligning ourselves with colleagues who want to do like-minded work, we can make big differences. Don't wait for your president or your provost to say, there's going to be a big initiative from on high to change campus culture. That's usually not how campus culture changes. I think what we've been impressed with on our interactions on so many campuses is the bubbling up of culture change, the power of individual faculty members and staff members to do simple, powerful things that focus on student success. And so don't be overwhelmed, keep it simple, and find good friends to work with, and you can make a big difference.
I just want to magnify that last point of that you can make a big difference. I mean, one of the great privileges of all the interviews Leo and I did is hearing stories from so many students around the country of how profoundly staff and faculty have affected these people's lives, their families, sometimes their communities. And so recognizing that there's a lot of transactional things that happen at our institutions and a lot of times to be efficient. But one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is how often when Leo and I, or Isis and Oscar, asked a student about a powerful experience they had with a staff member or faculty member, that student would begin by saying, this person won't even remember we spoke, but they won't remember this, but, right? And so the day-to-day interactions we have are really potential opportunities to have a powerful effect on our students' lives. And in some ways, it goes back to Yvette Perez and, asking how are you, and then actually attending to the answer. May not seem like much to me in the middle of a busy day, but that can be the first time that student, that day, that week, had someone really pay attention to them. And that's potentially transformative. So just recognize small things can matter a lot for our students. So thank you for all you do.
Well, thank you both. That was a fantastic way to end the series. So this is the final series in this section. We will be having 4 new authors and 4 new books to talk about next semester. We don't have those dates and times hammered down yet, but we will be sending out an email to everyone who's registered. I do want to thank you both, Peter and Leah. We really did. This was a great conversation, and certainly reminding us all why we do the work that we do. So thank you very much. Really important work, and we appreciate what you all are doing. So thank
Thanks
you,
for
everyone. And
organizing.
Thanks, Brittany and Katie and Ethan and everyone.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Take care.